I'm sure we'll meet again.
Hey, it's the newbie.
There it is. I was just here complaining about how much I don't like one of these old videos. This video's had the most views of any video.
Hey there. Good to see you again.
Later we destroy this
I
guy.
hope we're keeping you busy.
Camden. I'm Camden.
Well, technically, everyone in operations is dedicated to supplying the other departments with whatever they need. You operatives, field agents, and technicians alike supply information or get results that our executives use every day to make things happen. I'm just on the more legit side of things. Or the boring side, as some might call it. See you.
Don't cause any trouble.
Okay, hello.
Five blows loses charm.
In other news, on the lifeless planet of Akira,
Anyway, that's funny because what we're actually looking at here today. I'm messing around here with a query.
Are you there?
And rewriting a query. I'm just looking at read stuff. Finished reading Senate and House reports. And, you know, it kind of run quickly, but not too long. It's Ron Paul talking about amendments with the big, beautiful bill. It relates kind of critically more on some of what we're saying. I'm sure we have a draft for a complaint. What we'd like to do.
I guess this is what spaceships are gonna look like.
What we'd like to do is reach a final version of this complaint. And,
Struts retracting. Let's get out of here.
there's so many organizational principles at stake in collegiality and in terms
The
of
spaceship
authority.
looks cool.
And yeah, they're really waiting for some bunch of young people to really come back and kick their ass.
Orbital
And
pattern
Isn't that
locked
weird?
in.
you
How
know,
much everybody
it's
wants
gonna
a
be
spaceship.
people like me sitting here getting awful answers. Who actually have those answers. And I've been trying to kind of disseminate it for a few months. They just don't have the attention for it. Even the old people that are really history lessons. And you know, they're all really totally missing
Here's your start.
the Constitution. They're missing that moment
Figure it out. So we bounce
where
out here.
you figure out what it is. Even the even leading journalists can kind of run the story by implication, but it doesn't. They don't really carry they don't really carry a preamble approach on interpretation. They don't really talk about it. They're always trying to moralize and editorialize. And I guess their problem is that they don't do anything. And the Congress doesn't have.
Check it out.
If you don't have 2/3 of one party in the Congress, you snake it.
Grab jump.
Really willing
Grav jump complete.
to just create a fire like that.
Pilot, this is Jiro Sugiyama, head of Paradiso Security. I apologize for coming over this emergency channel, but we are in need of assistance concerning the large ship in orbit, and we value discretion in this matter. If you are willing and able, please see
There's
me
a
as soon
flat
as
Roman
possible
code
at the main
with
security
us.
office in Paradiso. Over and out.
With this public confidence, the way this argument, this is the ground section of the case, and of the complaint, and it's mostly pretty good. Improper terrorism designation, right? And this section here, the many incidents offensive to justice and domestic tranquility. This is probably the section that's least well defined, and executive orders have provoked increased frequency of unjust deaths and injuries in the hands of federal law enforcement officials. While individuals and agencies may cooperate with the government's prerogatives, the land to define immunity in the matter ex converso, where the legality of some actions is construed on incidents, but also on decisions for who to prosecute. Moreover, the general public have a well-established basis to object to arrest, so that when arbitrary arrests, and we just added this today from watching Rokano, so that when arbitrary arrests are observed in any community, one ordinary reaction is to attempt to limit the standing and authority of presumption on arrest. And this asks the question of whether any kind of expedited process is not intended to demean our domestic tranquility and provoke public opposition. Provoke public opposition
These parts are
and
kinda
aggravate.
goofy.
Provoke public opposition and aggravate.
But apparently this is what space looks like.
Provoke public
Size of
opposition
space is 200.
Beginning landing
and
cycle.
aggravate on the ground. On the ground.
Double sensory. Yeah.
And of course, the most serious argument is
Such beauty in the midst of
a lot of the
nothingness.
statutory stuff that takes place is nationalism and not constitutionalism. That should seem a little bit contradictory to like ordinary people.
So,
But critically speaking, nationalism is just the idea that the establishment of the state in itself is justiciable. And so you have a lot of times, you have this inherent philosophy of nationalism that says, oh, now that the United States has been ordained, we can treat these subjects in the abstract. And the truth is you can't do that with the Constitution. Everything has to go through the people and through the terminology of the people, the liminal theory of justice. And failing that, falling short of that, you run into a politics that just can't interpret what we're doing or why we're doing it. And that creates a lot of other kind of political harm and a lot of political confusion, right? Like I'm watching kids confronting ICE agents who in theory need to be told that what they're doing isn't constitutional. And of course they're under orders, so there's already a constitutional disagreement in that space. They can't get names, they can't get information, they can't take them to court, they can't take the agency to court. And then the other side of it is that, you have to get hurt in order to go to court. And so you have people out there willing to get hurt to go to court to see what it's going to be like. And the reality, of course, is that that's just bad process. You obviously have vicarious standing in the United States. Why are those things floating and frozen in the air? That's the bug is frozen in the air. I don't know that. That's a lot of pressure. The pack Seabat. Like Pokemon. Anyway, why do you have that? And it's like all this just gotta be simple. And I think historically, politically, we have a lot of people out here who don't understand it. And we know how to prove it. And so Congress say that you have vicarious standing to petition. And what that means is that if you observe false testimony, false testimony the Constitution dedicates the government, everything to the people. There isn't another basis for interpretation. You know, and that disagreement is really profound because you have people who didn't want a constitution, who wanted this kind of liberal to illiberal free society that was essentially rendered in kind of a city-state construction is, I guess, what they would have imagined, and then graduated to, you know, an empire of some kind. And you know that's wrong. And it's wrong for a couple of reasons. But the primary reason, governments affect people. They don't affect things. They don't affect national boundaries. You know, even if foreign affairs is hard to figure out without just a generalized construction of the nation and the nation state, its boundaries, its jurisdiction, international law, immigration, all that stuff falls back into, with Republicans, it falls back into called philosophy of nationalism. And it's kind of a bad idea. So it happens when we watch out. Anyway, and so constitutionalism just does everything by the people, and that's the liminal theory. With nationalism, you wind up with an integrative theory. It's kind of good for sciences and good for certain formats for collegiality, but they make mistakes. They can't fix mistakes. You know, they hurt people. It's not their fault. They lie under oath, and you know, it's a procedural barrier. It isn't an interpretive barrier. You know, it's a problem. And when you have problems like that in politics, you know, you have to get rid of the government, basically.
Oh my! Look, it's got it.
Shit, I'm complaining
They
about
killed him. I
something.
ate all that junk food and they killed him.
Video. There I am. Blah 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 blah. Kilbane, level 12. The white internationalist in space.
I can't believe they killed him.
Anyway,
I've never.
other narratives consistent. The appearance by the relaxed hiring standards, frequency of politicized hires contributes to an increased frequency of unnecessary, unreviewed uses of force. Detention centers themselves have no legal infrastructural integrity. And all I mean here is they don't like have a plan, like what are they like what do they do, you know, if somebody gets hurt. You know, there's a procedure, but the institution isn't built for that. To be without ordinary agency structures or access, such as lawyers and hospitals.
Animals?
I mean, that's not totally extreme.
Oh yeah, totally.
Law enforcement availability. You know, like they're trying to just like deport people, right? You know, and what's provoking is we're all part of this wave of people who are just a little bit too angry about what happened with this guy, you know, I think in California, and kind of guy in Utah that get picked up as well from these guys. And this section of the complaint is still kind of weak.
So what,
like we went through the preamble, we're telling you it's federal question jurisdiction. And at the end of this section here, what we have is, well, just to have kind of incorporated a timeline of events that have shown up in the media that we continue to see. We may have to pull official documents to prove some more general cause of action. But the idea of the complaint here, we talked about a racist terrorism investigation, and this argument is fairly careful. But it's not. We don't. You know, we're a constitutionalist. We're a federalist, so we don't actually do the rule of law approach that everybody likes so much, because it's not actually the Constitution. It's parliamentary law. You know, you just have a bunch of politicians who agreed on this, and you can't question or challenge them. And so what we do here is we use the preamble and a preamble approach across the whole.
Do you see
the whole
anything
thing.
useful?
We interpret everything. No stare decisis. Just raw logic
Sandflower, dude.
and what we describe as a liminal theory of
Oh,
justice. And
Sandflower,
you know, so we talked about terrorism, but terrorism is a criminal term, defines how violent actions used to attempt to influence decisions of state,
Choice,
how this
that's
intended
what
to
you
intimidate property.
Sandflower, Doomtown.
And the other section of the complaint has a little bit more explicit textual authority. We're not really trying to overly liberalize these subjects. We are trying to do is prevent the Immigration's Customs Enforcement Agency from enforcing terrorism designations. And the reason being that we can prove the president is lying, or at least is not true in his testimony. And we can also prove, in fact, that there are, how do you put this? We can also prove, in fact, that there are, that literally there are just like other solutions in law that are non-existent because of this other philosophy. And it's kind of the implied version of this thing. So it goes, no designation of terrorism proceeds without a discussion of criminal intent. There's no action that is terrorism without finding first some other criminal termination. You know, like, intimidating somebody or free speech isn't typically a terrorist act.
Where'd you go? Are you driving?
I think if I walk into a bank with a gun in my pocket, threaten everybody to release, Nelson Mandela, somebody would call that terrorism, but it's not if I don't have a weapon,
okay.
right?
I was gonna say, what do you think?
Alternatively, perceiving anyone committing a crime against the government to be a terrorist appears to be the broad prerogative of the Department of Homeland Security, including resisting arrest, assault against an officer, up to including planned assaults on federal buildings and personnel. And so we have this, a lot of us are talking a little bit recently about communism and how Trump is becoming anti-communist. He's being like Wilsonian or something. And, anti-communism, was the original fountain of white supremacy after the Second World War. And, besides segregation and Jim Crow. So designating the Department of Homeland Security to be the immigration front and primary enforcement mechanism in matters they come into foreign affairs and immigration law creates the broad perception that a foreign actor attempting crossing the border and attempting to vote as a terrorist, and this term may be applied in issues forward by the government. The question remains plain
Booster packs that are going for a long distance.
when the enforcement policy is defined and prescribed. And so much of what happens is directly against workers who are in the country. Periodically, sometimes illegally or sometimes on a quest for asylum, workers who come from the southern border or the Atlantic Gulf, frivolous or whimsical and profitless nation, may be racially motivated. And of course, I know the anti-PC patrol will object to that argument a little bit, but considerably, the politicization of the question asks not where, and this is actually constitutional logic. Considerably, the politicization of the question asks not where migrants are coming from, but instead asks whether such questions can, as originate from the Congress, have correctly defined both regional and infrastructural orientations of the migrant movement. And of course, that's the obvious goal of law here. And then we kind of picking up this guy we're talking about.
Fresh, you're supposed to be good. What? You're gonna go inside?
So it is possible the executive is assigned alternative. Let me restate the question. Alternatively, the question is whether we're really trying to get at what the basic and of course, or we don't want
Perhaps not the wisest decision.
And so this is statute. The executive is not in life rules assured federal field functioning even if the government's entire technical solution may be racist and more strictly confidential. Whereas a final solution should have admitted the infrastructural value of workers and developed incentives and limitations for peace workers to turn their heads. The government's current approach appears stalled on citizens' resolutions of Congress, where plain constitutional debate appears historically failing the understanding of citizens. As we show below, the Palatine exception is not consistent with the government as improper basis for interpretation. So this part of the complaint is a little bit complicated because what we're doing is we're limited a lot of in terms of interpretation. Because we the people it's obviously including some and of course the logic of the Constitution with their nationalist predicates, well, we have to have the standards of the reason. And if this is and then they stall the Congress and the delay of processes that are otherwise useful and the content of they recommend to keep that government documents from becoming theoretical government documents and the reality is, that's no matter how much history you think you understand, the right of the political party under a constitution does not exist. And I mean, nobody ever says that, but that's pretty much the U.S. Constitution. The origin of this that are not properly limited. And this is everyone wants to see a position in the court that says that the opportunity for this argument wants to see a position in the court from the government. They might just try to dismiss it really flippantly to be serious.
Give an opportunity to line our pockets.
One of the things that happens in that is that we might wind up with them committing perjury against us, because you can't prejudicially dismiss a complaint without answering its questions. But the Amendment 14. Decisions based on ethnicity, color may also include country borders are not properly limited, and what we want here is a discussion on. And your scan they have limits and quotas for entry into the government in some of these places, and those quotas. And I think what they want to argue is that those are all by definition limited, because Congress has done so, and the executive just follows Congress. And what we're saying is, well, at the origins of separation of powers is actually what exists at the origins of totalitarianism. It isn't a multi-phase. It isn't necessarily a multi-phase transformation of the exaggerated psychology of a killer. They're already killers. It's the fact that when you separate powers and agency, you limit authority of other agency by definition. So, in order to conduct limited government, you technically need a judiciary or an executive who is prejudiced to prevent other officers from committing perjury or even proceeding under terms of false testimony. In theory, there are places where somebody misinterprets the entire Constitution unintentionally. But the idea of limited government, the liminal theory of justice, is just so simple. It's the term of the people.
Well,
one sub
either
law,
we press on or we turn back.
Plotinus.
Your call.
It isn't, and that's where we get into this term, the elemental law. But that's essentially what it is. And that's those were the essential intuitions of the framers, is that, you know, everything would kind of come under the preamble. The preamble is your charging instrument for all cases and controversies, all things necessary and proper, all issues under a take care clause. So the executive tried to forcibly deport all these people, does all this stuff to kind of conspire against those populations, puts those people in danger, and then puts federal officers out there hurting people. And they're being disagreed with pretty aggressively. And the administration and some of the Supreme Court want to tell you that, well, it's qualified because of separation of powers. And what we're saying here is, well, separation of powers is not actually interpretation. It's actually called strict construction. And what that means is that those agencies themselves no longer interpret the Constitution of the United States. And, I mean, just by definition, that's a seditious resolution. That's a very serious argument. But that's the Constitution, and that's how the Constitution writes legal complaints. Improper terrorism designation. The perception foreign people carry of the United States is not always derived from a constitutional worldview. People may perceive the United States as not a populist friendly country because it shows neglectful and malefic methods that require numerous regulations. While claiming terrorism designation. Or claiming terrorism designation naturally defeats the rights and powers of people to take confidence in the real form of populism, which is naturally interpreted the Constitution of the United States just like advocate citizens versus other people, really the Politain exception after the Howard. The Politain exception is the Greek term that we find in Apium for the Athenian constitution. And so when we say Politain, what we really mean is the exception for the there are other types of there's more ephemeral construction, which is after like I run up the thing and then it stays back. I'm like, oh. Hilarious. I was just reminded of this random game we were playing. Not Vampire Survivors, but the 3D version. Just survived for half an hour. It's like a 3-hour video. Actually, the Bethesda guns in this game. This is all running on a Intel Arc 770. So I replace it. I'm really wishing they would come out with a new one. We should get something just beyond it. Even if the legalism is necessary in politics, we couldn't get the Constitution you know, we don't really know what liberalism is, and so you know, that sociopaths culture programming themselves to control cultural but if you really talk about how would you define the necessary because I don't have that stuff. And liberalism as a term is in how in a term it comes out of some Greek writing. And what you get is this idea that we're kind of free in the civil society. It's a little bit about freedom. But really it refers to the idea that when you set a rule or a law or a policy or a behavior, when you change it and do it, make an exception from the rule, that you, if the rule is designed a way to limit enforcement from it, and it can be open or efficient, or the idea that the law is stronger that you're not going to actually, the law is strong enough that you're not actually going to have to rewrite the entire civilization, to, hear a pleading or to, to tax somebody or to give somebody clemency or, to execute somebody. Like Socrates, gives you this whole famous thing. Well, it's not, the society is so good, I will not disagree with my state. And some people construe that to be the sort of doom of liberalism. But really, when you're talking law and when you're talking constitutional formalism, it is just things necessary and proper. And we can almost certainly build the objection for Socrates' security out of the death and what is it? It's Crito leading up to it, but it's like that. So we admit that liberalism is most, even you say that would be things necessary and proper. It's the easiest way to get to it. Otherwise, you're trying to say it's about freeing stuff and unloosening sails and G-strings or something. The people's cause and the statutory language available and can temper your question. And while this question may appear to be too much for the court, given that U.S. courts have not issued a standardized interpretation of constitutional laws, this approach admits how the congressional intent of the statute may be viewed to clarify statements proclaimed in malice of officer's perception of superhuman authority. And this is really where we get into the idea of ministerial fraud. We'll say it right. False testimony of the Constitution, if an error unwitting, may not necessarily be intentional fraud. On the other hand, if you're interpreting the Constitution and and there it goes. Not within the Russian
Hope wherever you store that, the smell will not be an issue.
Click a bunch of ectoplasm. The superintendent authority is also a huge idea. I don't know how many people do or don't understand that. Oh, you need that way of viewing those things. This is right when the game was first released. I still haven't really figured out how to play it, to be quite honest. I think I have to get a new video card. Even more plainly, to prevent serious acts of terrorism and not disgruntlement from minority or immigrant, the United States, the President, and several secretaries of Congress must be subject to United States courts on matters of interpretation.
That looks like it is worth bringing along.
Exception for justice, tranquility. This is tranquility. I didn't write that. General welfare and common defense, because the people affected by the United States are just as ourselves. Selfish interpretation, the virtue of selfishness, is of course ministerial fraud. Therefore, law of the United States, the public law, after Napolitan construction, are not constitutional but are conferential, and this is what we're calling the conferential critique. The conferential critique is just the idea that because governments affect people primarily and directly and intentionally, the government must limit the power it confers in the cause of the people. And so in the term of art of the same expression, you have constitutional government or you have conferential government. Because everything in legalism is in conference, it works that way. It's not too extremely difficult to interpret that way. That's how the Constitution was intended to be interpreted, we're pretty sure. And there are other affirmative arguments to that as well that some people might accuse us of trying to read into the text. But you'll remember that, all the parliamentary interests of some of the framers and founders and lawyers and kind of more middle intellectuals of the period, all of that stuff that those guys knew was essentially coming out of England. And even if you were afraid, oh, there's the pirate, even if you were afraid that the new government would not work with you, they kind of started going through like a transitional period, which is really pretty negative. And when Hamilton gets shot, it ends the work of actually clarifying all of that. It ends the work of telling people the truth. So that you get as far as, their little war of libels, and you never get to this idea, well, what is seditious speech? What is seditious? What is an exception from this convention? And now we have these bloated arguments about exceptionalism and about formalism. Yeah, these are gross. You find these piles of waste in the thing. Why does it have antlers? Is it possible that giant bugs have antlers? The character's totally wounded there. I think we're out of materials at that point. Oh yeah, those guns are not useful. I was like, what the hell is this? Am I supposed to mod this? Anyway, so to apply by implication the designation after terrorist and terrorism against immigrant, whose genuine object is to do work, is illegal by definition. And that's the Constitution's description of illegality, under the conferential critique. It isn't parliamentary law, it isn't a parliamentary approach. That's the constitutional perspective. You hear this argument that says, the word unconstitutional isn't in the Federalist Papers, and it's because illegality and unconstitutionality are both interpretive. Just because the Congress puts it on the thing or the executive says so, doesn't necessarily mean that the action itself was dedicated to the people properly.
Honestly,
the executive
I
must
cannot
take
answer
care
that.
in interpreting the law
So many years have
before
been
he
driven
actually
by survival in intense circumstances. Leisure time has.
and then
been in
this is
short
also
supply.
this is
And I
also an
suppose I
original
have
canon here.
conditioned myself to
It's
not
a
think about it
canonical
much.
approach
I do
to
enjoy combat
evaluating
training,
ministerial
though
fraud,
I
which is
suppose
called
that is hardly
unlimited
the answer you're
diversity.
looking
Does
for.
our
You've
disagreement
given me
here
something to consider.
not end? Like, if I have an
Thank you
exchange
for
with a
that.
law enforcement official, and the law enforcement official tells me the law, do I understand that the law itself is intended
Yes,
to
we
conclude
are done.
any further adversity between us? And like I was watching a video, there's some guy auditing the public space for ICE, and he gets into some guy's face a little bit. The dude comes after him, the cops put some social distance, they argue a bit. And what's really happening is that there's unlimited adversity in the community because there are people who either don't want to be watched by auditors in the community because maybe they're
Not many
afraid
options other
that
than
they're
to
being
proceed ahead.
tracked or profiled by little underground terrorist networks. Oh, look who this is. Oh, this is and technically it's all very casual at that level. Individual profiling, like racial profiling, is all originally very casual. And,
Caves like this
you
can be
know,
an
only
excellent way
once
to
it
conceal
becomes
the presence of an
standard
illegal
policy,
operation.
that's what they're talking
I should
about.
know.
14th Amendment privilege, or even just telling you that, anybody walking on the streets is expected to be in a criminal. Like those types of circumstances are borderline. We talk about Edgar V. Bull here. Edgar V. Bull is a case where a Mexican national was shot running over the border. He runs over the border, and then sees the agent. The agent tells him to freeze, and he runs back over the Mexican border. Once he's over the border, the agent opens fire against him and kills him. The family comes and sues the United States for the wrongful death, and loses the case. And Clarence Thomas gives us this really difficult argument. Justice Thomas, Associate Justice Thomas, gives us this very difficult argument that denies Bivens-type complaints at standing under the Fourth Amendment, where issues of homeland security are involved. He doesn't tell us, that the family's argument was wrong, or that their construction of jurisdiction was poor. That they were arguing a Bivens-type complaint on grounds for tort litigation, which is actually technically how that's supposed to work. The best argument is in fact that the best argument is in fact like fucking itches, man. Dirty itchy person. But the best argument is in fact that the officer himself was operating in bad faith, and that the government had not correctly correctly prepared him for that instance. You know, you can't shoot the guy running over the border. You can't treat him as a terrorist. And that's exactly the read on Edward as a plain limitation from the government's confidence in use of criminal power, that to kill a foreign national. We're a little over the edge on that to say criminal power. But, you know, the guy goes in, you know, if you can shoot him at any point just for resisting on the border, that's problematic. And it seems to communicate that valuation by implication. And we talk a little more about executive adversity here. And this is an extension of the unlimited adversity canon, where we see an instance where there's an original harm and cause of action committed against someone. Executive adversity being this kind of overbearing posture for certain types of circumstances. The current presidency has prided its administration on policies and model about generalization about iconoclasm. We're kind of
Lifting off now.
The formalities of doctrine are not strictly defined literally. You got a full power to so exclusively with the French, which reaching testimony relies on
We're looking into orbit now.
powers doctrine. Admitting executive being a sole agent, or to be a sole agent, may have unlimited discretion with or without congressional prescriptions. In the contemporary, there are many subjects which can be scrutinized on this canon, including superficial construction projects, economic attack sanctions against foreign countries, violations of congressional law against general conflicts of interest, unethical hiring and firing practices. There's way more stuff. So much of the contemporary decisional precedence of the Supreme Court has not been reviewed under a reasonably serious canon to evaluate whether the executive has upheld the Constitution of the United States of America, or instead has defined a
Settle down. Everything in the groove.
without qualification. So this is a subject that's and you want it to be bigger, almost. Like that bug, it's like the say like design approach. It's like, what the fuck is going on? And why wouldn't there be people in space in the Fallout series? I mean, I guess it's supposed to be the Fallout mod. It's like Fallout broke all of Bethesda's originality. Like Elder Scrolls.
Mr. Trophic, I am aware that this is your
like they have to have like
visit to our resort.
they have to have like a country in space called like Shavot in Xenogears, where you have the secret techno like techno austerity race living in a nearly parallel dimension governing the whole planet. That's what they need. Anyway, it would just be weird as fuck though. And then you get weapons, you wind up on the planet. I mean, somebody's got to have played that mod. Rational and social constructions of immigration policies of having been advanced in a vanguard. What are we doing there? Something happened there. That is, the executive, his orders in direct opposition to the standing of workers who compose by and large a periodic migration in the United States. Moreover, the executive's construction appears so leisurely that the Republican Party
see
is
why
there
this location was chosen for a resort. Very.
You know, this is executive adversity on domestic tranquility, and that's where we admit this position.
Nice.
On domestic tranquility. Well, the law itself goes is preceded under exceptional terms. And that's it. Moreover, we're supposed to watch this morning some video from Watch Out Ali talking about exceptionalism and American exceptionalism, about how good America is. And of course, the exception is always actually a bad thing. You know, if you're building stuff on a line item, you know, the exception should never be the rule. It's always a defect. And that's how the framers would have understood it. It's really weird how you have this how you have this advanced politicization of original theories for people it puts everything into a biblical literalist term, like biblical exceptionalism, you know, and then puts everything out into this other planet. They're obviously jerking people around. And the way you prove that, you prove either A, they're not dedicated to the people because they don't listen well enough, or you prove that they actually haven't defined conditional precedents, like Marbury versus Madison. You know, is about whether or not the lost congressional issue can be resurrected, and because there's not a statute already written for it, the court just demurs. And the reality is that denies the establishment of conditional precedents in the first place. And the court doesn't tell you what kind of statute it actually requires, and it doesn't encourage that the Congress would make that statute. You know, when you really read that opinion carefully, it's sardonic, and it's mocking the Union, and it's mocking the authority of the Revolution. The jokes that they had in the Supreme Court back then are very extreme. I mean, most people get that. Executive versus leaves the people vulnerable to perplexity over the rights and authority of law enforcement officials. Perplexity is a separate kind of analytical canon. You know, like Republicans attacking liberals are usually perplexed about what liberalism is. We criticize the Big Beautiful Bill as well in terms of grounds. The limitations from protections denied individual standing of deferred action status without any more authentic statute limitations, meaning that it was somehow defined by the U.S. Congress that it constitutes waste, fraud, and abuse to have provided health care to deferred action status persons as under ministerial fraud to do so. And I'm not sure if that's been clarified, but that's part of the cause and part of the centralization of the unitary executive. So we attack that issue. Although I think somebody's actually corrected that to some extent. It obviously is not fraud, waste, fraud, and abuse.
Don't order the 6 prawn delight.
The Constitution of the United States of America is not just, and so we just kind of go back to the Politaine exception on that one. It does not define a strict Politaine exception, and indeed would dissolve and sever the interpretable civil integrity of the preamble to do so. Meaning, you know, a group of minorities walks into the country and you can do whatever you want to them. You know, congressional terms on these positions are not in good faith, even where some would admit there's a plausible legal action. And this comes up, that latter statement there comes up in Relief Due later. Legality of action is not defined by express written consent of a federal agency, and it cannot ever be interpreted so. Instances of raw bureaucratic authorization are not forthcoming with clearer explanations. And that probably needs to be stated a little more clearly, but it's pretty good. Then the plain argument comes up, and this is just the demonstration of the argument. And part of this has a statutory exposition in terms of executive orders. And it says the Constitution of the United States represents how government is conferred power in the people's powers, because we naturally intuit how government affects people. For the effects of economic things,
no one's going to care if I call out sick from work for another week, right?
A form of conferential formalism, which admits how past precedents should be consistent with plain language and meaningful intent of the Constitution. Even language and conditions of precedents are not closely scrutinized.
I never tire of seeing beaches on almost any
or even weak. But when we talk about conferential formalism, what we're talking about is legalism. So your Constitution of the United States really is a whole revolutionary philosophy because it uses a liminal term for government of people. And that is how it's construed, because you can actually write laws to reject exceptions against the people, right? Like assault and is always an exception. A fraud against a person is always an exception. A robbery is an exception for one person. And it's a kind of low order political tort rendered by the perpetrator who believes either that he can get away with it or that the person is the due victim of his crime. And sometimes, you know, crimes are committed in desperation as well. In any respect, it's a rationale that takes exception from the individual person. That's how it was intended to be interpreted. One, some or all of the people, right? So, like, if you drop a nuclear weapon on the United States all simultaneously, you would take an exception from all of the people. If you passed a law that was guaranteed to do dramatic harm to the people in the future, for more or less a flippant purpose, you would instantly do harm to all of the people.
Be careful not to point that
And people who say, well, I disagree with that, I think we needed the Homeland Security Act, you know, saying, well, no, we didn't need immigrations, customs, and enforcement, questioning whether or not every immigrant was a terrorist. it seems like that builds a hyper bloated agency, in fact. And I think that complaint went out a lot way back in the 2000s. I mean, you know, if you want to just listen to all the useless media, I get so critical of the media from time to time, but, you know, my civil rights are impounded, so I'm losing time and money every day because the judiciary hate the civil rights of this Hispanic thing or something. So, but we figured we'd put this out because people want this kind of document. People should be writing this or adapting this. We demonstrate how the power under said executive orders has a clause in limit, and the right does not respect the people in the plenary term. But instead defines the logic of revolution and operates in a parliamentary and conferential term, in a term more arbitrary and less definite about the meaning it attempts to government. We're trying to simplify constitutional interpretation as best we can. It is always a critical analytical proof. Misstatement of authority or definition is remediable by any duly sworn officer. And this part here is incomplete. It kind of it lists everything. We're talking a little bit about executive prerogative. But the executive prerogative narrative is tired. You know, the post-Holocaust narrative was primarily about hunting Nazis and maintaining a grounded, centralized political position. And I guess it's transferred over for some people who want to hunt and harass conservatives somewhere. But ultimately, it doesn't petition the government. We evaluate in this context other more critical cultural questions about why we're so interested in anti-fascist narratives. And I guess it's primarily because there's somewhere out in the country are 20 million people who don't have enough history to interpret the contemporary. But the reality is they're not petitioning, and you know, they keep the opposition in that term keeps generating a politeia exception in a parliamentary term, and you know, we're at risk to run into a.
I was worried about my beach
Yeah,
body
here's
until I
the,
spoke with that lady at Enhance here.
Here's
I wish I had
future
booked a
Gaza.
stay for longer.
Solar frontiers. Yeah, seriously. And so here's the demand for injunctive relief, and this is our concept, and this is where we want to be able to push a judge further than what is, I think, is customary. We talk about imposition against U.S. Congress to implement a more characteristic program for incentivization cooperation. Basically, we talk about immigration policy, and one of the problems we have with immigration policy is that it doesn't really respect the worker. I mean, we have immigration quotas, and we have work visas, but we don't really respect the fact that these people are workers. That is, we're admitting them into our country. They're not an infrastructural policy. They don't have to be here if they don't want to. We'll get along fine without them. You know, there's kind of
I'm here to help
it's
if
kind
you
of like the work visa versus the vacation visa are kind of just extensions of the same idea of a visa. The government governs visas. And we say that's contradictory in terms of limited government. What we say in fact, the government has by law, like under constitution.
Oh dear, a guest. Dreadfully sorry you had to hear my complaint. How
What we say is
unprofessional
the
of
government, in terms of
Welcome to
constitutional law,
Paradiso.
has to
Doc
take
Huddleston at your
and
service.
apply
Do you need assistance checking in for
a
your
question
reservation?
where, when your immigrant comes in, right, what you want to do with somebody who's just coming here to work for 2 years or 6 months or 4 years or 6 years, right?
Interesting.
Is you
Yet
want to
you've
give them
decided to
a
take a
major
shuttle
tax
here
break,
or land your craft.
and you want
Well,
to
if you
deny
change
them
your
other
mind-
types of privileges. You want to and some
Oh,
people
no,
say that's
you're on
unconstitutional as
vacation.
well. But the reality is that you
take a
want
look at
in a
the list in the
constitutional term
system
for
and you
these people
happen
are
to
coming
find
here
anything while you're out and
on an
about,
infrastructural
I suppose
basis,
it would help
and
me
they're coming
out.
here to benefit
Please, don't feel
from the wealth
obligated,
that can be
however.
made in the United States versus, say, against the Mexican peso. You know, like what's
Broad question, but
like
I'll
facing
try
the
my
dollar
best.
right now, right?
Paradiso is the premier resort destination in the known universe.
Like it's still worth it, right?
This planet is as perfect as one could possibly
so-
imagine. That is, assuming pristine beaches,
So
constant
in theory,
beautiful
what you want
sunny
to do is
weather,
give them like
and
a
fabulous resort
minimum tax
accommodations
rate,
are to your
like a
liking.
total minimum tax rate, like 2%, like something ultra low. And then you say, you know, you
Parima
can
2
save
is
up money,
owned independently
you
by
can't
the
buy a house,
Paradiso
you can't
Group.
buy property.
We exist
you can buy a
outside
car.
of the United Colonies and Freestar Collective, yet
And
entertain
in
visitors
theory,
from
what
both.
you'll have are people,
The
you know,
Paradiso
working
Group
here
is
for
run by
periods,
several board
taking
members,
an enormous
many
money
of
from
whom
the
take
country,
residence
and then
within the
leaving
resort
the country.
itself. They establish
you
a
know, when
resort
people
as a
get
getaway
stuck
for
in the
all
country,
on the most
it's a
beautiful
different
planet
kind of
in the
problem, right?
universe.
Because you don't
And
know
I can tell you
what people are
that there were
doing
substantial
in
monetary
the country
investments to
in,
make sure of that.
you know, in 25 years.
Let me
Maybe
know
they
if
got
there's
married and
anything
got
else
stuck
you
up
need.
on a, you know, on a house loan, on a home
There
loan.
are so
We
many
don't really know.
activities I'm looking forward to
And maybe some of that stuff exists already, but
Welcome to
the work piece
Paradiso
in that
Gift
respect
Shop and
should be as broad as
Convenience.
can be,
Feel free
and
to
should
look
penalize
around.
people who would
And
otherwise try
before
to
you
stay in the country.
ask, there aren't any discounts. So don't
Is,
even
you know,
try
that is,
to
they
eggo
would,
with
you know,
me.
you'd hit them with a good tax rate.
Why would I? I have
For a
to
period.
sell overpriced crap
We talk a
to
little bit
rude,
about some anticipated
obnoxious
offenses here as
tourists
well.
all day.
Past financial shortfalls,
My
Government
uncle
Accountability
works
Office.
for the
We
Paradiso
talk about
board.
government,
When
the
he said he
GAO,
could get me a job
agency
here,
morale,
I expected
cybersecurity.
an
There's a
executive
couple other
level
problems that
job,
come up in
not
there, but that's primarily
this.
it.
But it's not
This is
all
the
bad.
this is the House
I
report
don't have to worry about getting
on the
fired.
big beautiful
And I
bill.
live in Paradiso for free.
Je crois.
Now,
Je crois.
can I
Je
get you
crois.
something, or are you going to keep asking questions about my life?
This reminds me of the Fifth Element.
Recall ever having the time, let alone the funds, for a vacation someplace.
The fuck is that noise? That's the people in the background. That's our character. Anyway, additionally, the GAO reported a problem with Vinci Morales' conferential solution. And we have a whole book written about this right now that we keep revising a bit on, but the conferential critique is pretty big. In legal rulings, the term comes up because you get a little CF and it says conferential, and it usually means it usually defines persuasively how a court declines. But it's a very broad constitutional term that can actually be applied across the whole idea because the government limits power conferred. You know, so we just take the root of that and we admit confluence and conferential, or a kind of agency or dative of agency. That's a ordinary grammatical rule.
Not to be a downer,
That's
this place is almost
kind of
too
beside
perfect,
terms consistent with abolition.
Hello, welcome to Tranquil. If you fancy a cup.
You know, an understanding of
seriously
things
never heard of
is
it?
kind of
It's kind
ultimately
of
necessary to
underground,
actually be able
but
to.
I thought by
to
now
really
everyone
interpret the
knows about
Constitution
it.
successfully.
We're lucky enough to be in the same system
If
as
you're picking
Billy
up
Butter,
Roman law
so we get the local video. I'm a huge
and Latin
fan.
squarely
Donovan
without
Reese
telling it,
himself came here and ordered tea at our little shop. He's
you're at risk
easily
to
one of the
interpret
best
law
runners.
as an
almost died a
imperial
little
or
when he kissed
parliamentary
my
standard in
hand.
some respect.
Anyway,
if only because
you
of the
should go there and check
construction
it out
element. That's
sometime.
my experience. Anyway, additionally, the
Come
GAO
by anytime
reported a
for a
problem with
wee
agency
cup of
morale,
tea.
cybersecurity. We may contest how much the temporary appointment is a conferential solution and typical leverage the specific agency reported to the standard simultaneously addresses that enthusiasm.
This is probably the best
we may contest.
vacation
We use
I've
this language
ever
here.
taken.
We may contest. We may contest. Its historical demands were in fact conferential and did only minimum diligence required. Diligence would ultimately be destructive of popular federalism with immigration. We talk a lot about the federalism of such and such agency or federalism of the thing. And a couple things that don't really get discussed is the federalism of the law, plainly, and federalism of impartiality, plainly, because so much of what we do in that term appears redundant to certain types of analysts. That's the kind of problem there is there. So strictly conferential interpositions with a big beautiful bill may be a consistent basis for Supreme Court resolution, as the court's more or less trying to build a unitary executive as a measure of either political conference republicanism or otherwise as a kind of dignitary rule respecting the presidency wherever it can. And that's pretty much the only way to try to interpret the court without otherwise accusing them of ministerial fraud. The desire to conform the standing of the court's opinions with the resolutions of the executive and Congress, the bill itself is highly controversial with the minority, and the expectation may be then, as outlined above, considering DHS programmatic risks and budgetary shortfalls, any position declining with the DEB should be considerably affirmed by the nation's high court so as to lend an appearance of impropriety. I don't want this to appear impropriety, but it's a contest. However, the terms of the specific executive order and statutes themselves are not in order. In order to stand for the people and are not an undisciplined political contest. Again, these positions are provable, and it would be an act
Excellent
of
sightlines. This would make a
decently
decently defensible
and
position.
harm so many people.
And the view is nice too.
Oh yeah, this next section is stupid. I think I was trying to jump on high already, and finally got on high for like 10 minutes. That's really good. We make it to the agency and pass this
If I could just stay here forever,
and reconcile it with duties otherwise consistent with immigration customs enforcement.
Why did I think 3 days was going to be enough?
And consistently resolving about executive responsibility of the affairs. That's kind of, and that's a longer arc. And that's where we start to blame, the Carlyle group and the Bush family for 9/11. Public confidence. The public's imagined confidence in a force in any sense has not shown any primary reason or mechanism by which the Constitution of the United States of America should have been interpreted. The actions taken by the Department of Homeland Security are unwarranted and interpreted from an exaggerated emergency and security standard. The public availing themselves, exaggerated and even unending emergency and security standard. The public availing themselves of the act know either a leisurely approach to the construction of law and cannot present a plenary perspectives that are not filled with personal animus and bordered with avant-garde perplexities. And of course, that's a more difficult statement right there, because if you're the justice, what you're trying to say is, well, it can't be as bad as admitting, say, an extra 5 orientation in the next 10 years.
Salut, bonjour,
good day. But the problem is fundamentally that,
welcome to Chez Simon.
The limitation there isn't constitutional. It's a more leisurely construction.
Might I interest you in some
and what you really want are systems that are admitting people for good reason, and that are respecting people for why they come to the country, and are not destructive or fatal to those people. And that requires more than a nationalistic perspective on immigration, for sure. The sovereign, him or herself, is not composed in the Supreme Court and the presidency and the Congress. It is always interpreted. Without that interpretation,
However,
you will finally construe, if the judiciary takes exception, you'll finally construe a culture
isn't
of what
as
you describe as
domineering
promissory
and
harm. We've heard that argument a lot.
at least not behind
Promissory
closed
harm,
doors,
it's just
catch
this
my
idea that people are going to get hurt.
Word is
And some of those allegations are true. Some of those constructions in the media and the news
are
are
often
less
subpar.
consistent. They
Normally,
work
I
that way.
wouldn't spread
To make
such
it test
rumors,
how
but
executive
that guy
versus
is
both adversaries
rotten
the Constitution
and
of the United
thinks
States of America.
way too highly of himself.
The people, including
Yes and no.
a primary model for
It's my
DHS is
name
one
on
where
the
the prior with
sign,
many
and
agencies
I generally get to run it the way I want and taking a significant chunk of the profits, but technically the Paradiso Group does own it. I even had to sign over my name to get it up on the sign. Part of my contract with them.
The Constitution of the
But
United States of America.
I tend to
The
look at it
Constitution, by the
as
way,
job
is a
security.
standardizable term.
What, are they going
that
to
is a
find
term that
another
can be used,
world-class bartender named Simon to
irrefutably
replace me?
to describe
I think
governments that are not constitutional, or constructions of our government that are not constitutional. And a judge, justice, a congressperson, an executive agency officer, under oath to recognize that argument, because the Constitution limits power conferred. Executive and diversity. Yeah, this part's cool. Like, all these places are supposed to look like big sky country. And then there are ramps. What's up with the weird jumps? It's so confusing. Jumps, leaps, bound, leap, bound, leap. I guess that dude can probably bench about 350. There's the trash section. Spend a few minutes in that section. I felt like there was I remember playing this game feeling like a lot of the places were a little bit nondescript. Like it suffered from the same problem, wanted like an extended multiplayer system. Anyway, actions best to destroy public confidence, assault the domestic tranquility while congressional resolutions that lead clearing infrastructural, some things, declaring infrastructural weaknesses? in prefatory and operative statutory reasoning to create the pragmatic illusion. Oh, and I needed the key to get in there. I feel like a state or something. Such a mechanism, however, is not properly limited to a qualitative exception for the people, reduces their standing in the informal leisurely stride, undermines public confidence in justice, and restrict privilege and the welfare common defense. Literally every primary beneficence of a popular government is eroded and threat for under expansion of agency and whimsical executive positions. And you know, we'll add a couple more things to this that will try to make this available and try to get people to just like go fucking petition. Because, you know, this country's ridiculous. It's, you know, we're all so smart. We know what we're all doing all the fucking time. And yet it's like they're trying to pretend that the humility of the people is somehow valuable. And, you know, you can't rely on the humility of the people. You know, that's how we got slavery.